This program is sponsored in part by the National Catholic Society of Foresters. Hello again and welcome to Looking at Social Justice. I'm Jim Grant and it's my pleasure today to have a second interview with Dr. Daniel OConnell. About a year ago, Daniel was the third guest in a series. Today he's the 50th. What he'll be talking about today is something I think all of us need to know more about and probably don't have the foggiest idea what it is today. It's the struggle for an agrarian democracy in the San Joaquin Valley. Daniel, I'm so glad to have you back. Could you begin by reintroducing yourself as the Executive Director of the Central Valley Partnership? Tell us a little bit about that, and then let's begin with a brief intro into this forthcoming book that you and your co-author are working on.
Yeah, I'm the Executive Director of the Central Valley Partnership. The easiest way to describe it is we're a regional progressive network bridging labor unions, environmental groups, and community groups across the southern San Joaquin Valley, pushing for change in policies and in culture.
About the research paper, this wonderful topic, this dissertation that now is going to be a book, can you tell us about the topic itself of research, the doctoral scholarship that it obviously entailed, and about the book, and especially about the concept agrarian democracy? Introduce us to this concept, which is also your email address.
The concept of an agrarian democracy comes out of a long-standing history in our country that is also sometimes called Jeffersonian democracy. And it is an outgrowth of a theory that evolves from my research that we'll talk about today. And this is basically the first book talk of a book that's coming that the dissertation and hopefully the book will be called In the Struggle. And it's an invitation for scholars, university professors, and people without degrees that use knowledge in their work to engage in social change and the improvement of our society.
You have given me 6 scholars who were activists, people that not only wrote, studied, and researched, but actually did something. So can you, do you want to tell us about Paul Taylor, introduce us to him and Dorothea Lange? Why don't you gracefully get us into these 6 great people?
Well, Paul is also an entryway into agrarian democracy, which I think we should define up front here. The idea is a simple one, and it's one that I think we need to understand more fully as citizens in a democracy. It's the idea that there is a requirement and a prerequisite to have an equitable economy and a vivid, vibrant, participatory civic life if you're going to have a democracy. That equitable economy is both an affects and informs, it's contingent upon, and an outcome of democracy. So if there's rampant homelessness in your society, it's a key indicator that there's corruption or that your democracy is not functioning well. And so it's a very easy way for us, if maybe the simplest way is to say, to have a democracy, you need a middle class. And there's ways to structure that. The San Joaquin Valley presents a context where it's the wealthiest, most productive food-producing region in the history of the world, and yet it has the highest levels of poverty, pollution, and paradoxically, hunger in the United States. Geographies are inherently constructed. We made this region to be this way. And before we all get despondent, that means that we can recreate it. We can change it, and that's there before us. So the scholarship is an invitation to understanding a theory of what democracy is, because this is an amorphous kind of elusive word, and to invite people to be active citizens and residents in their society, in a democratic society. Paul Taylor is our entryway. He's from the Midwest. He one of the first things I put in the dissertation is his work in the 1933 cotton strike here, where he brought Clark Kerr, the future chancellor of the University of California, who was his doctoral student at the time, to problem solve between the farmers and the farm workers in that strike. And Paul Taylor actually does do that. Later, he joins in the most deep and beautiful partnership with his wife, the photographer, the documentary photographer Dorothea Lange, who many people know from the photograph of the migrant mother. She also photographed the Japanese internment and other issues. Both of them together fighting against what they called latifundia, or this kind of feudalism that is present in American agriculture, and particularly in the San Joaquin Valley. They wrote a book called American Exodus, again a biblical reference to what was happening in the Dust Bowl and the migrants that were coming out here. Steinbeck ends The Grape of Wrath with the creation of a farm labor camp in Kern County. That labor camp and other ones like it were an outgrowth of the advocacy of Paul and Dorothea. Paul does his initial research on agricultural labor. He spends deep time in Mexico. He travels across the United States understanding agricultural labor and its history. Later in his life, after he retires for the most part, he becomes a scholar that's deeply vested in defending a federal law called the 1902 Reclamation Law. And this law is inherently an agrarian democratic law. It basically said the US government in 1902, Teddy Roosevelt's president, progressives are leading the charge after the Industrial Revolution. There's this period where Republicans like Taft and Roosevelt and others, Wilson to a degree, are progressives, promoting an equitable economy and a rich civic life in the democracy here. The law stipulated we're going to build dams in the western United States. The biggest project is the Central Valley Project. Yet you, farmers, are going to benefit a lot. We don't think that already rich people should benefit or speculate on the public investment that's coming your way, because water brought to an arid land enables you to not do dryland farming, dryland wheat. It enables you to produce almonds or houses in our Fresno context. So the law said something very simple. If you accept and sign a contract with the federal government, you have to be a farm of 160 acres or less, and you have to reside on the farm. You have to live on the farm. They wanted small family farmers, not agribusiness. The US government and vested in this huge investment of bringing water infrastructure across the western United States to ensure a middle class was going to be here. The valley was already dominated by large landholding interests. They did sign the contracts. The contract also said if you owned more than 160 acres, after 10 years, you had to sell all the excess land you have at pre-water prices. So for 10 years, you can benefit if you have 10,000 acres, but after that, you have to sell all of your land. The 1902 Reclamation Law would have instituted a benign, moderate land reform in the United States, one that would have greatly benefited us, and one that after we defeated Japan, we instituted in feudal Japan. Paul Taylor comes from the Midwest, where the Homestead Act in the 1860s divided the entire Midwest into 160-acre parcels, and that's why the Grange and other populist movements were democratic, not reactionary at those times. So the literal context of the development of the Midwest and its juxtaposition with agribusiness in the San Joaquin Valley is the difference between neo-feudalism and democracy shown on the ground in geographic terms.
So after the great work that Paul Taylor did with his wife, the second scholar, genius activist would have been Ernesto Galarza. Can you tell us about Ernesto?
So as we leave Taylor, let's just say the federal government subsidizes the development of agribusiness in some ways, not purposely, because the law wasn't implemented for 40 years, but they provide public water, a public subsidy to farmers. The second enormous subsidy, people think, oh, it's just these were smart businessmen that created these big farms. No, they were aided by a corrupt influence in the political system of the United States. The second huge corruption of our economic system by these large agribusinesses was the importation of farm labor, which had always existed. And first with waves of indigenous peoples, then waves of Asian immigration. Once the Japanese outcompeted the farmers here, they instituted alien land laws that purposely discriminated against them. Later, the Braceros program starts as a program to import labor from Mexico. The federal government was in Mexico with the Mexican government bringing farm labor into the United States. Imagine the enormous subsidy and need if you have tree fruit and cotton for that labor. So the system was only supposed to be for a few years. After it existed for almost 2 decades, starting in the 1940s during the war when all of our boys were fighting in Asia and in Europe. We needed extra labor, but the system that was supposed to last as an importation for that labor loss was retained for 20 or 30 years. Those braceros were very often abused, not paid correctly, housed in terrible conditions, but also used as strikebreakers. And this is why the formation of a farm labor union was never effective. Ernesto Galarza was raised, first he was in the fields at the age of 7 and did every job under the books. He ends up as a Mexican farm worker going to Occidental College for his BA. He goes to Stanford University for his master's. He goes to Columbia University for his PhD. And the first job he takes out of the gate is to be the farm labor organizer for the National Farm Labor Union. And in 1947, the first thing he does is he goes and foments a strike against DiGiorgio Farms in Kern County, based around Arvin, California, and goes toe-to-toe with basically the Paramount or the Boswell of the era, the biggest farmer in the United States, and punches him in the nose and fights for the next decade in a strike and legal actions. They sue him and the union. Eventually, the union is successfully dismantled through litigation, and I go through that in the dissertation. It's too long to go into now, including Richard Nixon lying in Congress to make this happen. But they effectively, by 1960, Galarza is so tired, he spends 3 months in the hospital unable to move, because for 12 years he's organized farm workers from across California, and he was the only person doing it. And finally, the union pulls its charter after a series of lawsuits against them. That was in 1960. But during those years, Galarza writes 3 books, 2 in particular on the Braceros program: Spiders in the House and Workers in the Field and Merchants of Labor. These books basically undermine the justifications for the Braceros program, and by 1963, the Braceros program, or Public Law 78, is eliminated through Congress.
Wow.
Notice the date, Jim, 1963. Within months, the UFW is up and going, and the first strikes on grapes are won in 64. Without the elimination of the Braceros subsidies as strike breakers and driving labor wages down, it's unlikely Cesar and Dolores would have had the success they did without the 15 years of work that Galarza committed to. At the end, he did other things, but I just wanted to say that this book, he comments later in an oral history, Farm Workers and Agribusiness in California, 1947 to 1960. It took him 20 years to write this book. Imagine the commitment, and he couldn't find work afterwards very easily. Imagine the life commitment that Galarza takes to do this work. So Galarza is the second scholar. It interrogates these ideas that agribusiness is just very efficient and effective. We subsidize the creation of it. Even to the degree at the UC system, which we'll see later, we'll get into that later, but the UC system, the Farm Bureau is created and housed at UC Berkeley for its first 30 years. Why wasn't the Grange the partner of the UC system? The UC system never wanted to admit questions regarding agribusiness. And so you see from both the public institutions like University of California and the state and federal governments and these private interests themselves all combining to pressure and subvert and oppress the farm laborers here in the valley and our environment as well.
The third scholar in the series would be Walter Goldschmidt. What do we need an intro to him before you do what he did? Is there a bridge between Galarza and Goldschmidt? Where do we go next?
So Walter Goldschmidt was the student of Paul Taylor, doctoral student as well. So scholars are passing the baton on and in conversation with each other, citing each other's research, but also mentoring and befriending and supporting each other. The federal government, the Bureau of Reclamation, contracts with the Bureau of Ag Economics to do a study on whether reclamation should be implemented in the San Joaquin Valley. So the federal government pays for research to be done. Walter Goldschmidt does that research, and that research to say, should the 160-acre limit and residency requirements apply to federal construction of the Central Valley Project? Goldschmidt answers that question by comparing the city of Arvin in Kern County and the city of Dinuba in Tulare County. Arvin is surrounded by DiGiorgio farms and large landholding growers. Dinuba at the time is surrounded by small farmers. Which city benefits? It's a simple case study. Dinuba had twice the retail business that Arvin did, twice the number of churches, civic groups, PTAs, newspapers, all of these markers of civic life. The farmers are spending their money in the town. They're buying their equipment there. They're buying their food there. And so the small businesses of Dinuba benefit. Meanwhile, Arvin is based upon migrant labor who often are not residents and or can't vote. They're being abused and taken advantage of. Twice the number of schools, on and on. Every marker, Dinuba shows itself empirically to be better than Arvin. The catch to the study is immediately after the USDA pays for this, they censor the research immediately. They do not allow the research to be let out because they want agribusiness to be subsidized and occur here. And a subsequent study that was going to do a regression statistical analysis of all valley communities, a much higher level of rigor, academic rigor in regression statistics than in a case study. There could be other reasons Arvin had these metrics that were less than Dinuba. But if you do regression statistics, it's a much more objective research. That research was suppressed and not allowed and not finally done until 30 years later at the University of California. Remember, the University of California never even had a Department of Rural Sociology, which all other land-grant schools have. The university itself was implicated in the subsidies that create agribusiness. So Walter Goldschmidt then publishes his Arvin Dinuba study. He had done his previous dissertation in Wasco in Kern County. The 3 case studies he puts together in a book called, biblically, As You Sow.
Wow.
A biblical forewarning that if you don't listen to what's happening, you're going to lose your democracy. So you shall reap. And Jim, I'd say that today we were reaping what in the 40s we could have averted if we had implemented federal law.
When Bishop arrived here, it was the time of needing to prepare the report for Rome about the diocese. So what I did is start looking at some of this information, not the scholarly part, but the statistical sharing of the cities that are most disadvantaged. And I was able to put in the report to Rome, there are 7 or 8 cities in the Central Valley as of the top 50 negative places around the country. These are pockets of severe poverty, and 8 of them are right here in our valley. So the evidence is something that your scholarship shows, but now even the Holy Father will know this diocese is a victim of tremendous manipulation of land, water, and resources.
And we need the Catholic Church to be here with us. Obviously, the Church was very involved with the United Farm Worker Movement, and we need that again. In 2008, there was a Fresno Bee article said worse than Appalachia. In the United States, there's 3 regions that are endemically oppressed or have these characteristics: the Mississippi Delta or the South, Appalachia, in the San Joaquin Valley. Yet of all of those, and you'll see similar extractive industries operating to suppress people and to hurt the environment.
We have about 8 minutes left, and we're going to move to our fourth scholar, and that would be Dean McCannell. So what can you tell us about the linkage between, or the difference between, the others and our friend Dean McCannell?
So we're going to move pretty quickly here. Goldschmidt gave me his research papers, but he passed away shortly thereafter, a few years after I got to know him. Dean McCannell, Don Villarejo, and Esau Fujimoto, I knew all. They're friends and they're mentors.
Wow.
Dean McCannell, 30 years after the Arvin-Dinuba study, the first Jerry Brown administration comes in and funds the university to actually do the retest of the Goldschmidt hypothesis. Walter Goldschmidt had a hypothesis that basically is the beginnings of that frame of agrarian democracy. Dean McCannell comes in afterwards and does the retest. He does the regression statistical analysis of the Arvin and Dinuba theory. He sets it up in a research design through the macro social accounting project at Davis, which he hosted and led there for 10 years. What is really important to note is in the 1960s, the intensity of the reaction to his research. For instance, the whole development of water infrastructure on the west side of the valley was happening, and the dean of the ag school, Dean McCannell, was invited by John Harris of Harris Farms to fly down to give his research to the west side growers and fly a plane up to get him. Dean tells a story that's in the dissertation that basically says the head of the dean of the ag school at Davis told him, "Don't you dare get into an airplane. John Harris wouldn't bat an eye to waste a pilot in a plane to get you." And Dean did drive down, and then was intimidated at that meeting on the west side, but he wasn't physically hurt at all. But this is the kind of intensity. The farmers started pulling their resources out of UC Davis, threatening Dean, undermining his research. It goes into a great deal of these kind of shenanigans that happen there. So Dean does the Goldschmidt retest and conclusively proves that it is valid. So now the onus is on the ag economists to prove us wrong. He also does one other thing. He realizes and articulates and finds that what happened and started in the San Joaquin Valley has now spread to the Sunbelt states of Florida, Texas, and Arizona, and the entire Midwest is starting to consolidate away from small farming. That by the 1980s, the farm crisis hits there, and the Midwest then craters away from a democratic economic frame.
So it did start here. This phenomenon that we do know as agribusiness across the country was born here.
In some ways, you could argue that agribusiness globally starts here. Because of this early start with the Spanish land grants, deeding land. So it was always unjust and unequal, and we never were able to push back on that, and that's our charge today. So we have two more, and we're going to run out of time, and they're worthy of their own time.
Which we will have another moment. Yeah. But in summary, we still have Don Villarejo and Isao Fujimoto. Tell us a little bit about these two great men.
So this is the 1960s that they're all working in. I mentioned the University of California never permitted this research to happen. Don Villarejo basically creates the Department of Rural Sociology 2 blocks from UC Davis campus by creating the California Institute for Rural Studies, CIRS. CIRS, he goes to Cesar and says, "You need a research arm." Cesar turns him down. He creates it anyway, knowing that it's useful for the farm labor movement. He then also does things like he sues the University of California for the development of the tomato harvester. But Don was also a teacher in a lot of ways as well, and mentored a lot of young scholars who wanted to ask these questions but couldn't find the room or the space or the permission, or were feeling threatened by doing so at the University of California.
And then I guess we do have your own mentor, Dr. Fujimoto. Tell us about him.
Esau. Esau is known through his students, of which I am one. He's a friend, he's a mentor, but he was my teacher. He was already retired, but I turned to him often. Visiting emeritus professors when you're in grad school is just a jewel because they have a ton of time and they're so knowledgeable. And so Isao taught me. Esau was the epitome of a teacher, a critically engaged teacher. He mobilized the students during the 1960s at UC Davis. There was no African American professors there, so he helped start the African American Studies Department. He starts Ethnic Studies Department. He starts the Applied Behavioral Studies Department. Esau famously hadn't finished his own dissertation at the time, and that's because he kept on being called to do all of these tasks. It was after 50 years when I was at Cornell, I went to some Cornell faculty and I said, hey, Esau's never finished his dissertation. Let's help him. And he did finish it after 50 years, and he walked at the head of the procession in Cornell into the stadium, acknowledged by the chancellor for his heroic work. The outcomes of his work blossom.
Wow.
Everything I do is attributable to him. The Davis Farmers Market, the Davis Cooperative, bike lanes in Davis. It's innumerable amount of projects, small farms, and so Esau is the teacher penultimate, and it shows what teachers do. Their life goes before them afterwards. There's a scene of a birthday party that Don Villarejo tells when he first arrives at Davis. It's all the students arriving at Esau's house for his 70th birthday, and each standing and telling what changes they did in the world, one after another, offering testimony and thanks and gratitude. Esau was interned. He was discriminated against. Rather than, if you know Esau, he's jovial, he's laughing all the time. He's the Energizer bunny of the movement.
Wow. We've got a minute, Daniel, so is there a nice way you'd like to tie this up in a bow, knowing we will definitely have you back to tell more about the Central Valley Partnership, especially how what you're doing now is building on the shoulders of these great, great leaders?
So I was once at UC Berkeley to hear Noam Chomsky speak, and one of these egghead Ph.D. students stands up and says to Noam Chomsky, "Thank you for doing our homework." And you could see the guy was an intellectual. And I thought, what a compliment. So I've done, and all of this work that you see before us is the homework done for somebody, but you can't actually have somebody learn. They have to engage and care themselves. This dissertation that was finished will now be a book. I'll try to write it in a digestible way, but people have to, Jim, participate in their democracy. You need an equitable economy if you're going to have a democracy, and we have to push forward on that and resist these gendered and racial and ethnic divisions that are being used against us as well.
Thank you, Daniel, for this special program on agrarian democracy. We will have you back in the near future. Until then, God bless, Daniel.
Thank you. God bless you.